coming along today to our Scope 1 and 2 Explained Lunch and Learn. I'm Emily. I'm the Program Manager for City Switch at the City of Sydney. And I would invite you just to pop your name and which business you're from in the chat. And I'd love to see which part of the country or which city you're in today as well. Please note that this session will be recorded and we'll run for about 45 minutes today. So I'll just give everyone a chance to join us. Okay. Great. So Katie, I'll let you continue bringing people in and we'll move on. So as always, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the original custodians of the local area that I'm on today, and I'd like to acknowledge their continued connection to country. I pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting. So today's agenda is about 45 minutes. I'm going to take you through a quick welcome and some City Switch context before we move into our guest speakers. Today, we're lucky to have Tony Holly, Principal Consultant at Adaptive Capability. He's taking us through the basics of Scope 1 and 2 for business. And our second guest speaker, Dr. Vanessa Rowland, is the founder at Climate Clever, and she'll speak to how their business platform can help you get started for free and also showcase a couple of City Switch signatories who are already using the platform as part of a pilot. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, and we'll also throw in a few polls today and get you thinking about how all of this applies to your business. So hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding and better informed to establish your baseline. So please drop your questions in as we move through the presentations, and we'll come to them at the end. So last month, we launched our pathway to net zero. The pathway has 7 focus areas and 16 actions on it. It provides a basic structure for office-based businesses to get to net zero, including the all-important internal engagement and capacity building. The first step on that pathway is, of course, to establish your baseline and measure your business emissions. So hence our session today to kick off a month focusing on this topic. Today is obviously part 1, Scope 1 and 2, of a small 2-part series online. Next Wednesday, we'll be hosting part 2, and the focus will be on NABERS. So how to use their online indicative rating tool to give you an idea of your emissions baseline for your office. It's a really simple calculator that will spit out your emissions data. You'll just need to prep 12 months of energy data and have some key office details handy to participate. If you are lucky enough to be in Sydney or able to travel in, later in the month, we're hosting a workshop on how to establish your Scope 3 emissions baseline. And then lastly, at the end of November, to wrap it all up, we'll distribute some beginner guides to cover all this content. So lots happening in November. So I'm going to flick into the first poll now. And I'll just ask Katie to launch this poll for everyone. We just want to get a sense of the businesses joining us today. How many offices in Australia do you have? Okay, so Katie's just launched that poll and it should come up in front of you. The options there, 1, 2, 3 to 5, more than 5, more than 10, or everyone's working remotely. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute, submit your answer so we can get an idea of how big the businesses are that are on the line today. So I can see it thinking about this. I've submitted my answer. Katie, maybe you can just tell me if that's coming through for you.
It is. I can see 29% have one office. It's still creeping up.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that now in the chat. So 33% have just one office. And then it looks like that kind of 3 to 5 or more than 5 is quite popular, although, yeah, 22% have more than 10. So really quite diverse range of businesses that we have joining us today. Some with just one office to manage, and then others with more than 10. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Tony now. Tony, as I said, is the principal consultant at Adaptive Capability. Adapt Cap's focus is on climate risk and opportunity and emissions reduction. And they're also a long-time City Switch signatory. So I'll pass over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Emily. So welcome everybody. I guess today we're going to talk about why you might want to measure scope 1 and 2. And sure, what is measured gets improved or managed. And for some of you, there might be extrinsic pressure to actually measure your scope 1 and 2. But for others, you're looking to get ahead of external pressure, or you're looking to do the right thing. Now, as Emily mentioned, on the 24th of November, we'll be doing a session on scope 3. And scope 3 is a lot more difficult and potentially time consuming and potentially larger for some of you than scope 1 and 2. But if we can move on to the next slide, Emily. So essentially what we're talking about here is what buckets we put different sort of greenhouse gas emissions in. So scope 1 is direct consumption of fossil fuels. So either on your site or in vehicles that are operating for your business. And in the case where there's actually, manufacturing or industrial processes, then yes, there will be other things like, chemicals and gases that are involved. But for most of you running, professional services firms or similar sorts of businesses, you're really going to be talking about what happens on your site and what vehicles you either own or lease and the fuels that they're consuming. And then scope 2 is essentially fossil fuels consumed off-site, but coming to you in the form of electricity. So as most of you would know, we have a power grid that has some renewables in it, but it also has some coal and some gas. And so there are emissions associated with your electricity. The exceptions to that is if your electricity, if you're generating, say, solar power on site because you have some behind the meter solar, or if you're actually purchasing green power, and there are certain conditions that need to be met for that to not count towards your scope 2. But potentially, if you are looking to abate your scope 2 emissions, then you can certainly enter into agreements to purchase renewable electricity. So if we can move to the next slide, Emily. The reason why I mentioned up front that scope 3 is quite large is for a lot of businesses, what happens upstream of them and what happens when their product is actually used involves far more emissions than the direct emissions to produce the product. So if we see here, we can see for various businesses, scope 1 and 2 might only represent, 1 or 2%. For others, it might represent 70 or 80%. But the point is that generally scope 3 emissions are going to be a lot larger. And you can think about scope 3 emissions in terms of if your business didn't exist and there was no business that came in and replaced it and sold your product or service. In other words, that function wasn't fulfilled, what would happen to emissions? So it's all the stuff that happens in your supply chain and then in your customer usage. But as I've said, 24th of November, we'll spend a couple of hours on scope 3 because it really is a lot more complicated. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, Emily. Okay, so we have a poll here. Does your business or organisation own or lease your offices? In terms
Just bear
of,
with me while I
Sure.
launch that.
Yep.
Everyone should say that now.
I guess the interesting thing here, the distinction that might be drawn here is that if you are leasing premises, then the building owner will pay the base building energy, so lifts, lobby lighting, and HVAC. So for you, that will appear as Scope 3 emissions. Whereas if you own the building, then you will be getting electricity bills for those things, and so they'll appear as Scope 2 emissions. So that's the distinction here between being a business that owns the building it operates out of versus leasing it.
Tony, I'll just point out the results. So there's a 55% who lease their building and 22% who own their building.
Sure. Okay, so moving on to Scope 1, what's included? And got some nice little logos here that give some pretty good clues. Basically, all the natural gas, so it could be used for heating hot water, diesel, often, for backup generators and other fuels used in the buildings, machinery or vehicles that are under your organisation's control. So even though you might have a leased fleet, and so you don't see, necessarily every single breakdown, if it's under your control, it's part of your Scope 1. As I've said, the other thing is that I guess a distinction here, which is not potentially large, but if you have air conditioning and there's some refrigerant leaks from the air conditioning, then that would be a Scope 1 emission for you. And typically you probably know that because you'd be talking to air conditioning people about the fact that you do actually have problems with your air conditioning. But I guess the overriding thing that I would say with measuring your emissions is it's better to be roughly right and err on the conservative side, as in make an allowance for things if you're uncertain, than it is just not to touch them at all. So if we can move on to the next slide. When we talk about, here we go. We've got the poll on vehicles.
I'll get that one happening.
Sure. And normally, even if you lease the vehicles, you'll have fuel cards associated with them. And so what you'll capture from the fuel cards is how many litres of fuel are being used. So we don't actually care how much you're paying from an emissions viewpoint per litre of fuel, but what we do care about is how many litres that are being used by the vehicles. And for the purposes of calculating Scope 1 and 2, it doesn't matter whether you own the vehicles or you lease them. It's all about the fuel used by vehicles that your company requires to do its business, or that it provides to staff, as a fringe benefit.
So it looks like most people here today should be thinking about company vehicles as part of their Scope 1.
Yep. Okay, so if we move on to Scope 2 emissions, essentially that's all the electricity you buy that is used in buildings or tenancies under your organisation's control. So as I said earlier, the distinction here is if you lease premises, there will be some central costs that are covered by your landlord. They'll appear as Scope 3. But where you tally up all your electricity bills that you receive directly, that represents your Scope 2. There are a couple of other things that are included in Scope 2, but I don't think they'll apply to the audience, things like purchasing heat or steam. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So what do you need to do this? And it's interesting because Vanessa, who's following me from Climate Clever, has some software that will make this a lot easier for you, for those of you that have quite a number of sites. Because the reality is you will need quite a lot of bills. And then you have to put the bills into a spreadsheet. And then you have to apply factors to those bills to then work out what your emissions are. So in terms of Scope 1, you'll need a year's worth of energy bills to determine your natural gas usage measured in megajoules, fuel bills for fleet vehicles controlled by the organisation, whether they're owned or leased, showing petrol and or diesel usage in litres over the year, bills for any other fuel used on premises. So in the case that you have a backup generator, for instance, and it actually does burn some diesel during the year, then that is a Scope 1. If you control facilities with air conditioning or refrigeration equipment, any gas leakages should be included. And that's something that you'd go to a licensed air conditioning maintenance provider to get. Okay, then in terms of Scope 2, essentially it's a year's worth of electricity bills for each facility, so you can add up the total kilowatt hours of electricity used. And as I alluded to earlier, if you actually have some behind the meter solar or you purchase green power or contracts, then there is some exclusion there, so that will reduce your Scope 2. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. What we're essentially doing here is trying to get a common unit of measurement. And in some ways, this is back to like high school maths, or if you prefer, thinking about it in terms of converting everything into a common currency. So if you do business in US dollars, in euros, in Korean won, Japanese yen, then you don't try and account in all those different currencies. You convert back to Australian dollars and you record everything in Australian dollars. What we do here is very similar, which is we convert all our emissions to tons of CO2 equivalent. So essentially what that does is it makes it clear how big an impact your emissions are having. So if you, for example, are responsible for a leakage of a tonne of methane, otherwise known as natural gas, then that's actually 25 times the level of consequence of a tonne of CO2. So you might think, oh, a tonne of CO2, a tonne of methane, it's all the same. Well, it's not. They're very different. And the way we convert the different emissions to a common currency is this tonne of CO2 equivalent. Now, in the appendix from these slides today, we have some examples, but that's essentially what you can think of the tonne of CO2 as the equivalent measure. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. Once we have this equivalent measure, where we can then work out what essentially are our emission factors. So we've captured how many litres of diesel or petrol we've used. Then we say, okay, well, when they're used and when they're burnt, what does that mean in terms of the tonnes of CO2 equivalent? And to work that out, we have emission factors for all the different fossil fuels that we would be using here. So there's a number of examples on this slide. There is actually a source for these emission factors. It's on the right-hand side of the slide, the National Greenhouse Account Factors, and that provides you with the factors that you need to convert your usage of fossil fuels into tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. Essentially, the process that you're going to go through to work out your Scope 1 and 2 emissions would look something like this. First of all, you confirm what standard you're going to. The GHG, otherwise known as Greenhouse Gas Protocol, is sort of the Bible, and it provides the most detail. Most alternatives refer back to some degree to the GHG protocol. So The ISO 14064 is a quality way of doing it, as in quality standard, and that is an option. Most firms are actually typically going with GHG protocol though, but if you are someone that had a lot of quality processes in place, you might choose that as a standard. So you choose the standard that you're going to use. You define the organisational boundary, which I'll go into a bit of detail in a second, along with the operational boundary. You collect and collate the data, and that could be done with the help of a tool like Climate Clever that Vanessa's going to talk about in a minute. And that would automatically help you with applying emission factors because they're in the tool. And then you ideally verify and certify the results. And obviously there's plenty of firms, including the accounting firms, that are more than happy to charge you to do all these things for you. And so really it's a matter internally of whether you have anyone that you think is capable of doing it. And if you don't, then you may look at consulting firms. Okay, we can go to the next slide. In terms of what are some of the guides that you can refer to, we have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it is, as I said, like the Bible. For this, if we look in Australia, the Australian government set up an organisation called Climate Active, which provides guidance on how to do this. And if you wanted to be carbon neutral or net zero certified in Australia, then Climate Active is a choice that you can choose. If you're part of an international organisation, then you might be better off using an international organisation like Science Based Targets, because then you'll be able to be consistent globally with what's used. And so it really is a choice, though, as to which standard you want to go with. Okay, the next slide. In terms of the organisational boundaries, this is voluntary at this point in time. It's expected that the SEC in America will make a number of these things a lot more prescriptive. But at this point in time, you can essentially choose, am I going to say that my responsibility is the percentage ownership I have? So if it's a joint venture, then you might own 50% of it, and you therefore might take responsibility for 50% of the emissions. I guess if you're a small organisation and you're running a single ABN and you don't have any joint ventures, then it's really pretty simple. It's what you're purchasing and paying for yourself. Whereas when you're a larger organisation and you have joint ventures, that's when the distinctions here come into effect. Now, the other distinction is in terms of control, and there could be an instance whereby you're the operator of a facility, but you have a large financial investor. And it is the case that you can then currently self-determine the level of responsibility you're going to take. So do you take responsibility for your ownership share, or do you take responsibility for the fact that you have operational control? So if you were, say, an engineering firm and you were running a facility, you could say, well, we're making the decisions on all these things, so we'll take full responsibility for 100% of the emissions, but you can also go back to the economic interest approach. Last slide, thanks. So in summary, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the go-to standard. Some of you will already be subject to, I can't say the word, but NGER's reporting, which is essentially the National Greenhouse Emissions Reporting Scheme, which was set up for large emitters so that Australia would actually know what large emitters were doing and how they were changing over time. The Scope 1 and Scope 2 is fairly easy to get from your bills, and it's essentially what your organisation directly uses or controls. I've briefly covered the concept of tonnes of CO2 equivalent, which is our common currency to calculate Scope 1 and 2. And as I said up front, Scope 1 and 2 is a great place to start, but it's only a fraction of your emissions story. And for a lot of you, your scope 3 emissions will be fairly significant. And there is the upcoming City Switch session on the 24th of November, which goes into more detail on scope 3. So I'll hand back to you, Emily, and we look forward to hearing from Vanessa about Climate Clever.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Tony. That was great. I've just seen Roger's questions that come in. I was going to ask if anyone else wants to drop questions in. I'll pass over to Vanessa and then we can come back to that. So I'm just going to stop sharing and let you share, Vanessa.
All right. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Emily, and thanks, Tony. That was fantastic. You provided such a good explanation. It is Tony, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Provided such a great explanation about how complicated it all is. All right. So let me see if this works. Is that?
Yeah, that's great.
That's working. Okay, fantastic. I can't see you guys anymore, but right. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. We're doing a little pilot with City Switch currently. So we've got about 10 businesses that we're taking through using our platform, which has been fantastic learning for us as well. And I was just going to show you really briefly how it works in our platform, how to capture those scope 1 and 2 emissions and what sort of emissions are currently being captured. And then give a few examples of some of the businesses, what their footprint is looking like. So yeah, just really briefly, what is Climate Clever? Yeah, we've created an online platform, as Tony mentioned, that's helping to sort of simplify this process. We've built in all that complexity and all those complicated carbon calculations under the hood of the platform. We update those emission factors every year or more regularly whenever they come out. Include and update emission methodologies and calculations. And so it's really a simple process for you just to enter that data yourself, or we can help you with that as well. And you can basically try to achieve whatever goals that you're looking to achieve. Just very briefly, the way it works, we created Climate Clever not just as a carbon calculator, but as a process to help you on that journey. So you can measure your baseline carbon emissions and then track that year on year. We also provide an action platform where you can look from hundreds of actions that we have currently in the platform or generate your own. So manage your actions online, get your staff engaged with that. You can track your progress throughout the year and then offset your emissions if you want to as well. And then you can generate your report automatically through the platform that just pulls the data that you've entered into that. So our mission is to make climate action more affordable and accessible for everyone, because as Tony said, it's sometimes, because it's such a complicated process and often involves consultants and things, that's not always within the budget of a lot of smaller organizations. So we're trying to create another opportunity for those smaller organizations to get started. So I'll just jump into the app. I might have to stop sharing for a second and then reshare. Okay, this one, okay. So once you've logged into the Climate Clever app, and you can sign up for free to get started, you'll see at the top here, measure, action, track, offsets, reports. That's sort of that process I just talked you through. Measure is where you enter the data, and these are the emission sources we currently have in the platform, but we are constantly adding new emission sources as well. So I think this week or next week, we'll be adding stationary fuels as well. So if you had, for example, a generator on site and you're just burning diesel, or if you have large vehicles that are like earth moving equipment or whatever, you can just add the litres of fuel to that. We also will be adding hotel night accommodation and ICT equipment, but all these those last two fall under the scope 3 emissions. So I won't go into that today because I know you're going to have another session on that. So here, in terms of what are the scope 1 and 2s that we include, electricity, as Tony mentioned, is a scope 2 emission. It also has a portion of scope 3 emissions in there as well, but we won't go into that. Gas is another, that's a scope 1. LPG is a scope 1. So these are the fuels that are combusted on site that are literally producing emissions as they're being combusted. And the rest here are actually scope 3, apart from the vehicles. I'll just quickly jump in here to show you when you go to add a vehicle, you can add the specific type of vehicle, and you can say whether it's a commercial or non-commercial. So non-commercial being a staff vehicle that they might use for commute. But if you say it's commercial, then it will add it as a scope 1 emission. If you say it's non-commercial, then it'll add that the emissions as a scope 3 emission. And then if we're looking at electricity, we usually use the utility bill information. So again, you jump in and you add a new account, you put in your electricity account name or number, you select the utility company that you're with. If it comes from a landlord or a real estate provider, you could just click on that. You'll have to do that probably a little bit more manually. You might actually even have to reach out to your landlord because it might just be included in the outgoing. So you really want to ask them how they've calculated your energy use for the cost, and say you actually need those consumption in kilowatt hours. So it might be on a square footage basis or something, but it's your right to ask exactly how they've calculated that and for you to get that number. Yeah, and then you can add whether it's green power or carbon neutral power, and we'll deduct that in the back end as well. And you can say whether you've got solar panels or not, and that's also taken into account with your carbon emissions. And then you can add as many meters as, so if you owned your own building and you had several meters in the building, you can add several different meters as well if you have several meters under that one account. They're often called NMIs. So once you've added your account, you can just add the bill. We just look at the date, from and to, total consumption and total cost. Also, as Tony mentioned, we don't need cost data for calculating your carbon footprint, but we like to capture it in our platform because it helps to tell that story, hopefully, that you're actually saving money as well. So I'll show that in the track in a second. But there should be a correlation between reducing your carbon footprint and saving money as well. So that's, sorry, I should also mention, you can also upload a CSV full of your data. So if you have access to your electricity bill directly through your utility provider, you might be able to download a CSV of like the last 2 years worth of bills, and then you can just format it the way we need it to be formatted. So you can download our CSV template and then just upload all of them at once. So again, we're just trying to streamline this process to make it easier to enter the data. We're also working on this new functionality called Bill Fetch, where you can log into your utility provider directly through our platform, and then we'll just go in and grab your bills when they arrive. Again, enter it directly for you. So for electricity, gas is a similar process. LPG, so if you had a barbecue, for example, at work and you get gas bottles, you can just add a once-off purchase. We just grab it in the kilograms. You can just say the weight per bottle. And I've shown you vehicles as well. So vehicles, we're just currently capturing the distance, but we're about to add in the ability, if you use fuel cards and purchase actually litres of fuel, the ability to type in how many litres you've purchased as well. So that's how we capture the scope 1 and 2 emissions here. I won't go through this, but actions, this is where you can look through our database of actions and manage your actions here. And then track, this is where you can see the breakdown of your footprint as well. So this is a quick snapshot. I'll just put it as 1 year, the snapshot of your carbon footprint. We haven't actually, at this point, we haven't split it into the scopes of emissions. So this is just the sources. So that's the flights, the waste, the electricity, gas, water, paper, and vehicles. So the size of the bubble is obviously how big that particular emission is. It will show what the total footprint is down here. We talk about it in gross and net. So you can see here the paper disappears when we say net, because that must have been carbon neutral paper. But again, that's a scope 3 emission, so we won't dwell on that. And then you can jump in and view those emissions, interrogate them more as well. So up here you can see a yearly or a monthly view. If you want to look at it yearly, you can track it over a number of years and hopefully see that downwards trend. You can also look at it from a cost and a usage perspective. And then if you wanted to look at it on a monthly perspective, you can see it this way to see how you've hopefully reduced compared to the same month last year. And again, similarly, you can look at this. So unfortunately, at the moment, you might find that when you're looking at the cost view, that your costs are going up, but don't despair, because your carbon emissions might still be going down, or your usage might be going down, and that's just reflecting those rising prices. So I'll leave the demo here. Oh, actually, no, I'll just quickly mention this as well. So this is where you generate the report. You put in your ABN, you select which year you want to do the report for, and then it will mention if you want to, it will remind you to purchase offsets if you want to. You can also skip it, and then it will tell you what your total footprint is here. And I just wanted to mention this because Tony mentioned it as well. We can add 5% of, as in sort of, they call it an uplift factor or minor sources. So if you haven't included, for example, this is again as a scope 3, but say you don't get your water bills and you wanted to sort of include, you know, something around that. And as Tony said, it's better to be conservative and add more than completely ignore it. So you can add 5% to your total emissions. This is a common practice under the NGERS reporting as well. So I just wanted to mention that. We'll also, in this report, you know, we ask you to suggest if there's reasons for change, if you're not including a certain site, or if you're not including certain emissions, it will ask you why you're not including them. So that we just want to be as transparent as possible through all this. I'll stop sharing that, and now I'll come back into my presentation. There we are. So, yeah, just wanted to show this sort of track page for a couple of different businesses. So this was one of our City Switch businesses. It's sort of quite a big, small to medium business, 200 plus staff. They were surprised by the size of their vehicle emissions. It was interesting though, because as they started to really delve into the data, they owned a lot of company vehicles, but they actually let their staff use those vehicles for private use as well. So they didn't really have a way to differentiate between when the vehicle was used for staff or home use. So they're sort of working out their own way of taking into account, because I think they ultimately want to offset these. So maybe the person adds 50% towards, you know, offsetting those emissions for those vehicles. And then, yeah, so electricity was a big one for them, gas, you know, and being able to see what your scope emissions are here, you know, it made them start to implement some ways of reducing those emissions. So I think they're currently transitioning from gas-fired heating to electric heating and cooling, you know, using renewable energy. And they had some LPG there as well. So that, yeah, their overall footprint was around 40 tonnes. This is a small office with 23 staff. This was their footprint. So again, just the scope 2 emissions for electricity and their vehicles, their business vehicles. So that's the size of theirs. This is actually our footprint at Climate Clever, and the reason why we currently don't have a lot of the other emission sources is, yes, we're renting a co-working space. We don't have access to the water bills, so we're in the process of trying to ourselves to, you know, see if we can get access to some of that data as well. But again, there's sort of different scope, their scope 3 emissions. So we've only got the electricity as the scope 2 at the moment. And so we don't have any company-owned vehicles or anything like that. And refrigerants are an important one. They can often be included in that 5% uplift factor as well, to include that. And these are 2 other businesses that are outside of City Switch. We've got a medium business with 100 plus staff. The biggest part of is their scope 2 electricity emissions, and then they've also got the vehicles. And then another small business with 4 staff. So you can, I think this footprint is about 250 tonnes. Yeah, and this one's, you know, less than 10 tonnes as well. Okay, that was actually the end. So I'll leave it there, and I'm conscious of time as well, because I think we wanted to be done by 10:40. Oh, sorry, in 4 minutes. So yeah, I'm happy for any questions as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Vanessa, for taking us through the Climate Clever business platform and some of those examples there. I think it helps to make it clear with those bubbles what the scope 1 and 2 emissions baseline looks like. And we have had a couple of questions in the chat which have been answered, but I'll just kind of reiterate those in the last couple of minutes. So Roger asked, why isn't air travel covered in scope 2 or scope 1 rather? And Katie and Tony have just responded there. If your business is lucky enough to own a corporate jet, then perhaps it would be considered scope 1, but otherwise it's someone else's plane, so it's an indirect scope 3 emission. So thanks for answering that one, Tony. And I asked the question about about vehicles, and I mean, my understanding was that, and I know it does get tricky, that leased vehicles were scope 3. So interesting to understand how it can be a little bit complex there with the types of lease involved, that you might want to check with a consultant to, or an expert to confirm for your exact case. Is that right, Tony?
I think the key distinction there is what's the vehicle being used for. So if the business is like a delivery van and it's being used for the business, then it doesn't really matter that it's leased. It's being used for business use, and so should be captured as scope 1. I guess the thing where I would say it gets tricky is when you've got a company car provided for an exec. For FBT, they'll want to claim that it does get used for business, but really it's just something for the exec to use to commute to and fro the office. And I mean, I noticed Vanessa was saying, well, they might count that as scope 3, and certainly that's the area where it gets a bit fuzzy. But I guess the point is, does it matter if you count it as scope 1? No, because you're assuming more responsibility, assuming direct control. So I guess that's probably the overriding theme that I would take with all these things, is that this is like doing, maths homework. If you provide your working and you provide your rationale, and your rationale is, well, look, it's a bit fuzzy on a couple of these vehicles, but we've included them as scope 1, then anyone that is coming from a climate perspective looking at that will go, oh, these guys are really taking it very seriously, because they're writing up scope 1 and 2, and they're including some things in scope 1 that they might be able to get away with putting out into scope 3. So that is what the way I would look at it is, be roughly right, and if you've got a tough decision to make, assume that you're going to capture it as scope 1 or 2 and just document it. And then you will be doing, you will then make more explicit decisions, in terms of, do you buy an EV versus buying an internal combustion engine vehicle, with looking at those emissions in mind. So to me, there's not really much downside in including it. I don't know what your view is, Vanessa, but.
No, I 100% agree. I think, the more ownership and ambitious you are with it, the better. But I guess I just want to stress that this whole carbon accounting exercise is it's all based on assumptions, and and as long as you're transparent about how you've done it, exactly as Tony mentioned, just to say this is what we have done, you can't really get in trouble for it. The whole thing is about being transparent about, these are the assumptions we've made, or these are the calculations, and this is why we've done it this way. If someone wants to question you on it, you might consider doing it differently the next year. But it's more, what we're trying to avoid is this sort of notion of greenwashing, or the ACCC cracking down on you if you've just kind of gone out there and said we're carbon neutral, but we haven't really explained how we've done it, or what emissions are included. So as long as you're constantly documenting everything and transparent about how you've done certain calculations, I think you're doing the right thing.
Great, thanks, Tony. Thanks, Vanessa. We've had a quick question from Paul come in. I'm wondering if it is a quick question, as we've just hit time. Tony or Vanessa, would you like to answer that one, or shall we come back to Paul?
I'm happy to have a go at it, but I reckon Tony's probably going to be better at it. My initial, I feel like we're in quiz night or something. If I'm purchasing chilled water from district cooling scheme, do I consider energy? So, I mean, my first reaction was, if it's being chilled on site, you'll be capturing under your own electricity. But I actually don't even know what a district cooling scheme is in terms of. Oh, do you mean chilled water for cooling the office?
Perhaps I'll put you in touch with Paul, and we can discuss that one further and get to the detail.
All I would say on that is David could certainly come back in that detail, because one of the buildings that David was involved with, they did actually have chill beams on site. But I think it is a good question. But I think at the end of the day, you've got to consider the energy used to generate the chilled water, because you're not measuring the energy content of the chilled water.
Okay. Thanks for that, Tony. I'll just wrap up. We've got some next steps, hopefully on screen, that you can see. So I mentioned at the beginning, we have some further events on establishing your baseline. You can register for those at cityswitch.net.au. If you haven't already completed your acknowledgement form to let us know that you're on the net zero pathway with us, that'd be great. And then finally get started. Thanks again to Tony and Vanessa for speaking today. Before you all depart, I'll ask Katie to just drop in one last survey, and if you don't mind, just letting us know how useful you found today's session before you say farewell. That'd be great. Thanks, Jack, for coming along.
So I would say that definitely in terms of the question from Paul, I can get John from Osborne Smith Consulting to come back to him on that question, because it's way beyond my pay grade, really.
Okay, I will. I'll find out where Paul comes from, and we'll make that happen.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Tony. Enjoy your afternoon, everyone.
Okay. Thanks,
Thanks,
Emily.
guys.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, guys online and girls.